Welcome back. Now, Namibia declared drought as a national state of emergency due to poor rainfall, highlighting the devastating impact of prolonged dry spells on agriculture, food security, water resources, and of course livelihoods. The country's arid and semi-arid climate makes it inherently vulnerable to drought, and the situation has shown that it is no longer just an emergency but a recurring challenge. Joining us to discuss Namibia's participation at the 16th session of the Conference of Parties, also known as COP16 of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, is the Minister of Environment, Forestry and Tourism, Pohamba Shifeta. So good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, and a good evening to the viewers.
Namibia has been actively involved in combating drought and land degradation. So how does the country's participation, at COP16 align with those ongoing efforts?
Yes, maybe before I come to the point, answering the question directly, just to make the public understand that there are 3 UN conventions, the Rio Convention, regarding the environmental affairs. That means how we have to take measures. The conventions normally are legal instruments, international instruments that are put there to ensure that as nations, different nations, we have to agree and agree to those treaties and comply with those treaties. Now, we have a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's a very big one, a major one, and I think for now we can say that it's a conference that is attended by mostly head of state, compared to none, mostly head of state, especially the convention that 2015, when we came up with the Paris Agreement. That convention was attended by more than 108 UN member states at the head of state and government. So it means that it's something that we as nations, different nations, have got interest, because each and every nation is affected by this climate change. And the climate change is the driver of what we have now, drought and land degradation. It's because of climate change, global warming that caused all the disasters. And now we have also a UN Convention on biodiversity, and to look at this instrument that looking at how we can conserve our biodiversity. And this is exactly, all these are intertwined. But without climate change, we will not have all these problems. Now, it is sine qua non. Climate change is sine qua non, and that's the big elephant in the room that we have to tackle. That's why, as nations, we converged in Baku last time, in last month, just to discuss it. But there's always disagreement, because you have the developed countries and the developing countries, and all of us the two have got a very divergent interests.
Right.
So, and therefore, that's why we always leave without having an agreement. Even right now, we left and without having a consensus, and they only agreed later. But as developing nations, we have to be a more consensus. But now on this one, to come back to your question, the UNCCD, that we call the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, it's mostly to combat desertification. Desertification here, we talk about the decrease of our vegetation and even the disappearance of our vegetation, because it happens. And when you look at some of the areas, even when we are growing, some of these are disappearing. Some of the vegetation, some species are disappearing already. They disappeared. And there's no way that you can have them unless you reforestate. And that reforestation has to take place in areas where you have water. If you don't have water, you can't. And now with all this recurring of droughts events, so you will not be able to do that. in some of the area, like for instance in central north there, it was always like those years, 50 years ago, there were vegetation there. But now you don't see much of the vegetation disappeared completely.
Yeah.
Some get decreased. So now, when we attended this conference, for instance, a conference like a COP16 where we attended now, that means a conference number 16. That means there were other conferences before. We count on the numbers. This was a very important conference because it came at a point where we have much of our, for instance, African, especially in the southern part of Africa, we have a very, very, very severe drought. Namibia, we have our tale to tell, a bad story to tell, that we are going through a very, very serious drought. And that's why we have, the president had declared a national state of emergency. A national state of emergency in terms of Article 26 of our Constitution, a very serious emergency state. It's very serious state. That we are in a very serious state of emergency. And it's already telling us that we must do many other things as a nation. And at a multilateral platforms, we have to contribute in order not only to benefit, but also to convince the other nations what to do in order to prevent further land degradation and loss of biodiversity. Because if we have to lose this, and the way we are losing the pace now, this pace, that means that we will end up having land degraded, and that will definitely affect our livelihoods.
I'm afraid we're going to run out of time, so I'd like to engage you on some other matters as well. Talk to us briefly about the opportunities discussed at COP16, provided for Namibia's, to enhance its drought preparedness, and also what was touched on in terms of land restoration strategies.
Yeah, the conference started, when I joined the conference, I only attended the higher level discussion. And one day, Sunday, and I left already by now. And it's still going. The conference is still taking place. We have our technical officials there. Now they have to get into the nitty-gritties of discussing, looking at what areas there we have to agree on as nations, because it's very important for us to understand and agree on, because each nation has to bring a case on a table and to discuss that, and to agree on one, in most of these things, agree on one or two things together. It takes always long. We have to be a consensus. We did not really come with an agreement now. There's no outcome yet, but our discussion is mostly surrounding the issues of land restoration. That's the land that is degraded, very much degraded, and the desertification, to mitigate that desertification, especially in countries where we have, like Namibia, for instance, we are arid, and most of our parts are semi-arid. We only have a small part where we can call a forest. Yeah. And it's now the degradation, and because of our practices, our livelihood practices, overgrazing and many other things, it's ongoing. So how do we make sure that we curb this? So when you are there, we of course also tell our case on these platforms, and we also lobby for funding. And that's why we have to make sure that through this kind of platforms, we get funding for supplying of water, for instance, drilling boreholes, because we do this almost every month in many communities. That is to avoid communities concentrating on one area. And mostly we look at areas where we have more people who have more cattle, because you allow this cattle to concentrate on one area because there's only area that has water,
right.
And the areas where there's grazing, there's no water. So we have to make sure that we split the grazing so that you prevent land degradation and overgrazing.
In line with the SDGs, how is Namibia updating its policies and laws to address land degradation, biodiversity loss, and also even climate change?
Yeah, as we converge, we look at our national policies and instruments and legal instruments, and this also help us to synergize some of this. And at home here, we're already trying to revisit our Forest Act and also our drought preparedness policy, national policy. We need to do that, and also our risk disaster management act. So in order for us to prepare ourselves, because when you look at our Forest Act and its regulations, we really need to revisit that in order to prevent over-harvesting of our vegetation, of course our timber, and to prevent even export. And we have already put a stoppage on that. Had we did not do that, by today most of our forests are gone, could have been gone, and because people were just over-harvesting without permits, and they don't understand the effect of this, because without forest you will not have rain, and that's why people don't understand. They just over-harvest, and because of we don't have trees today in some part of Namibia, we don't receive enough water.
Yeah.
Enough rainfall, and it's cut in most part. We probably receive only half or less than half even. And this drought, some parts you don't even receive any drops of water, of rainfall. So it tells us that we need to adjust some of our policies and legal instruments.
Well, any final remarks? You just briefly, you did mention, of course, that no resolution has been found at this point, but maybe in line with that, the possible ideals that you'd love to come from COP16.
Yeah, it is just that as Namibians, we are required to contribute to this effort, because if you don't contribute to this effort, when we say please don't harvest trees or timber without a permit. Don't just cut trees without permits. It's because we project that if we do that, in few years to come, we will have a desert in some areas where we have a forest today. And it happened before. And now we are blaming our ancestors what have they done, because probably that understanding was not there. Now we are fully aware that if we over-harvest and we cut trees unsustainably, where we are now, we are going to be more in trouble. That means drought will be more severe in the future. So our restoration of our loss of biodiversity and degraded land, it is now very, very vital. And these efforts we are trying to make sure that every Namibian contributes to this effort, because it is a case for every Namibian.
Yeah. Minister Pohamba Shifeta, thank you so much for joining us here this evening. We appreciate your time.
Welcome. Thank you.
When we come back after this brief break, we continue on with the daily roundup here. To stay